It's very important to understand that nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. They're not a perfect deterrent, but in terms of the weaponry that one can acquire, that a state can acquire to maximize its prospects of survival, nuclear weapons are what you want. Ehud Barak, former prime minister and defense minister in Israel, has said, the reason I believe Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons is because it makes so much sense. In other words, Barak understands if he were an Iranian, he'd acquire nuclear weapons. I have said publicly on numerous occasions that if I had been the Iranian national security advisor over the past 20 years, they would already have nuclear weapons. It makes eminently good sense to me that Israel has nuclear weapons and that Iran wants nuclear weapons. Again, it's because they are the ultimate.
This video was over a year ago. And Professor Mearsheimer, I'm sure everybody watching this channel will probably have heard of it. He's one of the most respected political scientists in the world. He wrote the Israel lobby back in 2006 and 2007. First it was an article, and then they made it into a book. And since then, he's been on the forefront of basically just explaining how these things are happening in the world right now, especially in the Russia-Ukraine war, and now the US-Israel-Iran war. And he's one of the main proponents of saying American foreign policy for the past 3 decades now. Israel has had too much influence in American foreign policy over these 3 decades or so. But yeah, we're going to get into the video now, guys. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me to keep this going, and enjoy it. Let's go.
Nuclear weapons are basically weapons for peace. If you have a Middle East where every state has a survivable nuclear deterrence, the likelihood of war is much less than if you have a Middle East where nobody has any nuclear weapons. And it's because nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. It's hard to imagine scenarios where they would be used. And if you have two countries that have nuclear weapons in the Middle East or any place else on the planet, they're unlikely to go to war with each other for fear that they'll get incinerated. But the problem that you face is you can't be sure that they won't be used. It's very important to understand that. They are the ultimate deterrent. They make for a more peaceful world, but you can't be sure they won't be used, which raises the question, how do you think about them? And the best example to highlight this has to do with the Cold War. We've run the Cold War one time. We ran it with nuclear weapons. Let's say we run the Cold War again, and you have a choice. You can set up the architecture under which the Cold War is run. You're God, right? You have two choices. You can run it again with nuclear weapons, or you can run it again without nuclear weapons. Which one would you choose? If you run it with nuclear weapons, it's highly likely that you will not have a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. If you run it without nuclear weapons, just conventional forces, it is much more likely that you'll have a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Which do you choose? There is no approved solution here. It's really a matter of taste. I'd do it with nuclear weapons again, but I would not sleep well at night because there's always a possibility that nuclear weapons will be used. So what I'm saying here is they are the ultimate deterrent. They make for a more peaceful world, but it's much more complicated than that. Third point you want to think about is proliferation. Proliferation has two dimensions. One is the actual proliferation process, where a state is in the process of acquiring nuclear weapons. And then there is proliferation where the other side has now acquired nuclear weapons. Proliferation has taken place in the Middle East. 5 countries now have nuclear weapons, right? There's a difference between getting there and being there. And getting there is a very dangerous process because there's a powerful incentives for other countries to attack your nuclear facilities before you weaponize. And of course, this goes to the Israel-Iran case. If Iran really does begin to go down the nuclear weapons road in a meaningful way, right, the incentives for the Israelis to attack it in the process are very powerful. You also want to remember, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's important that it have a survivable nuclear deterrent, right? In other words, if the Israelis were then to attack, or the Americans were then to attack Iran, if its nuclear deterrent was survivable, that would be very different than if Iran had nuclear weapons that were sitting on an airfield and were a big fat target for the Israelis or for the Americans. So if you're going to have proliferation and states are going to acquire nuclear weapons, the best situation is for those states to have survivable nuclear deterrents so they can retaliate after they're hit.
Yeah, that's why Russia has this thing called the dead end or the dead man's end, which means even if the United States strikes them, they still have, and they like decapitate every single head of military, every single one of them. There is literally a mechanism in place where if even everybody dies, Russia will still be able to launch nuclear tipped missiles to every city in the United States. Go look it up. It's actually fact. So nuclear exchange between America and United States is a guaranteed mutually assured destruction.
Fourth point you want to keep in mind, it is in America's interest, and we act this way, to make sure that there is no proliferation. We are adamantly opposed to proliferation, period. And from our point of view, the best possible situation is one where there's only one state on the planet that has nuclear weapons. And guess who that is? Uncle Sam. Okay, we do not like proliferation. All of this is to say that Israel and the United States have the same interest when it comes to Iran. The Israelis don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons for all the obvious reasons, and we don't want them to have nuclear weapons. With regard to Israel itself, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, we did not want Israel to have nuclear weapons, right? So the United States and Israel have fundamentally different views on the Israeli nuclear deterrent and whether it's good that Israel has nuclear weapons and that Israel has not signed the NPT.
You know, one thing, United States didn't want Israel to have nuclear weapons, and one person was John F. Kennedy. He was literally dead set Israel would not have nuclear weapons, and for some reason it died. Nobody knows how it happened. Wink, wink. But anyway, he dies, gets taken out of the way because he was calling for inspection in Dimona, and he gets taken out of the way. The person that takes over literally just gave them everything they wanted.
But on Iran, our views coincide. Final point I want to make has to do with enrichment and reprocessing. There's two technologies that really matter, and I'll talk more about this when we get to the Iranian case. Enrichment, where you enrich uranium, and reprocessing, where you reprocess plutonium to produce bomb material. In other words, you can go down two different roads to get that fissile material that makes a bomb. You can reprocess plutonium, that's what the Israelis did, or you can enrich uranium, and that's what the Iranians are doing. And to get way ahead of myself, what drives the Israelis crazy about Iran's capabilities is not that they have nuclear reactors. That's not a big deal. What really matters is they can enrich and they can reprocess. And as long as you can enrich and you can reprocess, it's not that hard to get a bomb. And the Iranians, as I'll talk about, are not that far away from having a bomb. It's because of that enrichment capability and that reprocessing capability. Okay, those are.
And that's why currently in the negotiation, and the one thing that is kind of like putting like a spanner in the works in the negotiation is because America's position has been Iran can enrich up onto a certain level for civilian use only. But the Israel position is no enrichment at all. Because if you can enrich, that means you can get a bomb, just according to what Mearsheimer just said. And the reason why, and Iran has said on so many occasions that we are not trying to build a bomb, but Israelis do not believe that because the way they got their own bomb to was sneaky. So if obviously they project it onto other people, what they can do, they know that if they can get their own nuclear weapons in certain ways. Obviously, Iran can just say, "Oh, we're not trying to get nuclear weapons, guys," and then they can just go ahead and get it. So that's why they do not take whatever Iran is taking, whatever Iran is saying at face value. They're like, "No, you can say you don't want it, but we don't trust you, and you're just gonna go do it either way." So that's the issue. That's the issue. That's why negotiations keep failing every single time.
My background points, and they, of course, will feed into much of what I say here. We start with the Israelis and talk about, first of all, the basic history, how they got the bomb. Let me then describe their nuclear arsenal. And then we talk about its usefulness. The Israelis started down the road in the mid-1950s. David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, was deeply committed to making sure that Israel had nuclear weapons. And his right-hand man was Shimon Peres, who, when I was young, was a big muckety-muck in Israel. And he and Ben-Gurion got the program started, I would say, in a big way in the late 50s, 56, 58. And believe it or not, what made it possible was assistance from the French. The French and the Israelis were quite close at the time. And as I told you, the Americans did not want Israel to have nuclear weapons. And I'll say more about that. But the French and the Israelis had a lot in common, and the French were willing to give the Israelis a reactor and reprocessing capability, the ability to reprocess plutonium. And once the Israelis had that, right, they were off to the races. Just a quick point on this, as many of you remember, there was a very famous war in 1956, sometimes called the Suez War. It's where Britain, France, and Israel, attacked Egypt. That is evidence of the Israelis and the French working together. And again, the French played a key role in giving the Israelis the necessary technology. It was not us that did it, it was the French. Second point you want to remember, if you look at the story of proliferation during the Cold War, before 1968, it was reasonably easy for a country to acquire reprocessing capability and enrichment capability. Because the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom opposed nuclear proliferation, were so busy competing with each other. The intensity of the security competition in the first half of the Cold War was so intense that they did not cooperate sufficiently to prevent proliferation. It's a very interesting situation. Both the Soviets and the Americans were opposed to nuclear proliferation, but they couldn't cooperate enough to really slow it down because they were involved in an intense security competition between themselves. By the late 60s, they come together. The NPT, 1968, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, 1975, and they don't completely shut down proliferation, but they do a great deal to shut it down. The Israelis, because they started in the 50s, as I described to you, got in before the Soviets and the Americans really cracked down. So it was in December 1963 that the Israelis' nuclear program went critical. In other words, they're producing the fissile material. And then it's somewhere between 66 and 67. You can't get the exact date in the open literature that the Israelis actually had a bomb. It's 66, 67. So you can see the Israelis got in early. They were very lucky in that regard. A lot of other countries did not get in early. And furthermore, they had help from the French. What about the United States? A couple points there. As you know, I wrote this book on the Israel lobby with Steve Walt. There's no question that there's lots of evidence of the lobby at work, supporters of Israel in the United States who were working to make sure that we did not slow down the Israeli nuclear program. But I'm not sure they were that necessary, in large part because the person who was really committed to preventing Israel from getting nuclear weapons was John F. Kennedy. And he was shot on November 22nd, 1963. And LBJ, as you well know, became the president. And LBJ had a love affair with Israel that was not altogether unlike Joe Biden's love affair with Israel. And the end result is that Johnson basically looked the other way. So it was Johnson coupled with the power of the lobby that really slowed us down from discovering and stopping the Israeli program. We kind of knew it was there, but looked the other way, is really what happened there. And it's also just important to understand that, and I'll give you some of the reasons why in a few minutes, there was significant opposition inside of Israel to developing a nuclear bomb. Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres, really had to push very hard to get it through. And it wasn't so much significant opposition from the outside, although the United States was deeply committed to some extent under Kennedy, but not so under Johnson, to slowing or stopping the Israelis. But there was opposition, significant opposition from within. Final point just on the history here. The Israelis have never admitted that they have nuclear weapons. It's one of these bizarre situations where they have what's called an opaque deterrent. They're not really fooling anybody, and I don't know why they insist on saying we're not going to confirm or deny that we have nuclear weapons. They do have nuclear weapons, which brings me to their arsenal. They have 90 plus warheads. I wouldn't be surprised if their number of warheads were up in the hundreds. Most people think they've produced enough plutonium, they've enriched, reprocessed enough plutonium for somewhere between 100 and 200 warheads. But most people give them 90 warheads, 90 plus warheads. And they really don't need more than that, as I'll make clear in a moment. And as you know, when you have nuclear weapons, remember what I said, you want to have a survivable nuclear deterrent, right? The Israelis want to make sure that if Iran ever gets nuclear weapons, there's no way that Iran in a first strike can take out Israel's nuclear arsenal, or any other country for that matter can take out their nuclear arsenal. So what the Israelis have done is they've deployed their warheads on 3 different kinds of systems. This is what the United States and the Soviet Union back in the day, Russia today, China today do. You put them in the ground or on the ground, land-based ballistic missiles, either in a silo or on a mobile platform. That's land-based ICBMs. Or you put them out in the water in a submarine, or you build bombers or fighters that can bomb targets from the air. Airplanes, sea-launched missiles, and land-based missiles. That's the triad. The Israelis have, I think they used to have Jericho 1s, and they now have Jericho 2s and Jericho 3s. Those are the land-based missiles, basically hid in mountains during peacetime and rolled out on mobile platforms in wartime. They also have Dolphin class submarines. I think they have either 5 or 6 Dolphin class submarines that have cruise missiles that are nuclear armed. And then they have F-15Is and F-16Is. These are fighter planes that are adapted to carry nuclear weapons. So they have this triad, and it is survivable.
These are literally the 3 ways they are able to deploy their nuclear weapons. Go read this book called the Samson Option, which means any other country just threaten Israel, there is always going to be that option where they are going to be able to retaliate and just bring the whole world down with it. It's very informative, and you learn a lot from it. Yeah. But anyway, guys, I'm gonna make the part 2 of this video based on how it does really. And now, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me to make this video and also to bring them to you as well. Have a wonderful rest of your day.